Okay, so once again, good day everyone. So our topic for today is about the theoretical and conceptual framework. No, so again, theories are formulated to explain, predict, and understand phenomena, and in many cases, to challenge and extend existing knowledge within the limits of critical bounding assumptions. So the theoretical framework is the structure that can hold or support a theory of a research study. So the theoretical framework introduces and describes the theory that explains why the research problem under study exists. Okay, so a theoretical framework consists of concepts and together with their definitions and reference to relevant scholarly literature, existing theory that is used for your particular study. So the theoretical framework must demonstrate an understanding of theories and concepts that are relevant to the topic of your research paper and that relate to the broader areas of knowledge being considered. So the theoretical framework is most often not something readily found within the literature. So you must review course readings and pertinent research studies of theories and analytic models that are relevant to the research problem you are investigating. So the selection of a theory should depend on its appropriateness, ease of application, and explanatory power. So the theoretical frameworks strengthens the study in the following ways. No? Of course, an explicit statement of theoretical assumption permits the reader to evaluate them critically. The theoretical framework connects the researcher to existing knowledge, no? Guided by a relevant theory. You are given a basis for your hypothesis and choice of research methods. Theoretical framework actually articulating the theoretical assumptions of a research study forces you to address question of why and how, and it permits you to intellectually transition from simply describing a phenomenon you have observed to generalizing about various aspects of that phenomenon. No, having a theory helps you identify the limits of those generalizations. So a theoretical framework specifies which key variables influence a phenomenon of interest and highlights the need to examine how those key variables might differ and under what circumstances. So by virtue of its applicative nature, good theory in the social sciences is of value precisely because it fulfills one primary purpose: to explain the meaning, nature, and challenges associated with a phenomenon, often experienced but unexplained in the world in which we live, so that we may use the knowledge or that knowledge and understanding to act in more informed and effective ways. No? On the other hand, no, there are some strategies for developing the theoretical framework. No? So number one, for you to develop a theoretical framework, examine your thesis title and research problem. Doon ang unang focus. Ano ba yung aking title? Ano ba yung research problem ko? Because the research problem anchors your entire study, informs the basis from which you construct your theoretical framework. Number two, brainstorm about what you consider to be the key variables in your research. Sabi ko nga kanina, answer the question, what factors contribute to the presumed effect? Number three, again, you need to review related literature to find how scholars have addressed your research problem and identify the assumption from which the author or authors address the problem. You need to list the constructs and variables that might be relevant to your study. Group these variables into independent and dependent categories. No? Review key social science theories that are introduced to you in your course readings and choose the theory that can best explain the relationship between the key variables in your study. No? Discuss the assumptions or prepositions, no, of this theory and point out their relevance to your research. Because a theoretical framework is used to limit the scope of the relevant data by focusing on specific variables and defining the specific viewpoint or your framework, no? Yung theoretical framework mo talaga. That the researcher will take in analyzing and interpreting the data to be gathered. No? It is also facilitate the understanding of concepts and variables according to given definitions and builds new knowledge by validating or challenging theoretical assumptions. Now, what will be the purpose of the theoretical framework? So, we need to think of theories as the conceptual basis for understanding, analyzing, and designing ways to investigate relationships within social systems. So that to that end, we have some rules served by the theory can help guide the development of your framework. Number one, means by which new research data can be interpreted, encoded for future use. No? Response to the new problems that have no previously identified solution strategy. No? Means for identifying and defining research problems. No? Means of prescribing or evaluating solutions to the research problem. Ways of discerning certain facts among the accumulative knowledge that are important in which facts are not. No? Means of giving all data new interpretation and new meaning. Pwede yun. Or means by which to identify important new issues, no, and prescribe the most critical research questions that need to be answered to maximize understanding of the issue. No? Means of providing members of a professional discipline with a common language in frame of reference for defining the boundaries of their profession. And means to guide and inform research so that it can in turn guide research efforts and improve professional practice. No. So the theoretical framework may be rooted in the specific theory, in which case your work is expected to test the validity of that existing theory in relation to specific events, issues, or phenomena. So many social science research papers fit into this rubric. Let's say, for example, peripheralism or peripheral realism theory, which categories perceive differences among nation states as those that give orders, those that obey, and those that rebel. Could be used as a means for understanding conflicted relationship among countries in other, let's say in Africa, in Russia, in Ukraine. No, a test of this theory could be the following: does peripheral realism theory help explain intrastate actions such as the disputed split between southern and northern, like let's say for Sudan, no, for Korea, no, that lead to the creation of two nations. However, you may not always be asked by your professor to test a specific theory in your paper, but to develop your own framework from which your analysis of the research problem is derived. Based upon the above example, it is perhaps easiest to understand the nature and functions of theoretical framework if it is viewed as an answer to that basic question. So, number one, what is the research problem? How should the individual in the state relate during period of conflict? No? And number two, why is your approach a feasible solution? You need to justify the application of your choice of a particular theory and explain why alternative constructs were rejected. No? We could choose instead to test instrumentalist or circumstantialist models developed among ethnic conflict theories that rely upon socio-economic, political factors to explain individual state relations and to apply this theoretical model to periods of war between nations. So the answer to these questions come from a thorough review of the related literature and of course reading. Pag nagre-read tayo, summarize and analyze in the next section of your paper. And the gaps, sabi ko nga kanina, in the research that emerge from the review process. With this in mind, a complete theoretical framework will likely not emerge until after you have completed a thorough review of related literature. So, just as a research problem in your paper requires contextualization and background information, a theory requires a framework for understanding its application to the topic being investigated. When writing and revising this part of your research paper, keep in mind that you need to have a clearly described the framework, concept models, or specific theories that underpin your study. This includes noting who the key theorists are in field, who have conducted research on the problem you are investigating, and when necessary, this historical context that support the formulation of the theory. This latter element is particularly important if the theory is relatively unknown or it is borrowed from another discipline. Okay, so you need to position your theoretical framework within a broader context of related frameworks, concept, models, or theories. So there will likely be several concepts, theories, or models that can be used to help develop a framework for understanding the research problem. Therefore, note why the theory you've chosen is the appropriate one. Kailangan, kasi pag tinanong ng panel, what do you think that this theory is more appropriate than the other available theory related to your proposal? So dapat alam natin yon, no? We could able to describe our theoretical framework, no? We will be able to fully understand on how do you think that this theoretical framework is, of course, fitted, much more fitted to your proposal. Again, in developing your theoretical framework, the present tense is used when writing about theory, no? Although the past tense can be used to describe the history of the theory or the role of key theories, the construction of your theoretical framework is happening now. So you should make your theoretical assumption as explicit as possible, no? So your discussion of methodology should be linked back to this theoretical framework, no? Don't just take what the theory says as a given, no? Reality is never accurately represented in such simplistic way. If you imply that it can be, you're fundamentally distort a reader's ability to understand the findings that emerge. Given this, always note the limitations of the theoretical framework you've chosen. Let's say, what parts of the research problem require further investigation because the theory inadequately explain a certain phenomena. So kailangan natin i-consider yon. Now, mayroong mga instances na we borrowing theoretical construct from elsewhere. Di ba? So parang, okay, ito na lang gamitin ko, no? So, an increasingly important trend in the social and behavioral sciences is to think about and attempt to understand research problems from the interdisciplinary perspective. One way to do this is to not rely exclusively on the theories developed within your particular discipline, but to think about how an issue might be informed by theories developed in other disciplines. Let's say, for example, if you are a political science student, no, studying the rhetorical strategies used by female incumbents in state legislator campaigns, theories about the use of language could be derived not only from political science, but linguistic, communication studies, philosophy, psychology, and in this particular case, feminist studies. No? Building theoretical frameworks based on the postulates and hypotheses developed in other disciplinary contexts can be both enlightening and effective way to be more engaged in the research topic. No? Do not leave the theory hanging out there in the introduction, never to be mentioned again. So under-theorizing weakens your paper. So the theoretical framework you describe should guide your study throughout the paper. No? Be sure to always connect theory to the review of pertinent literature and to explain in the discussion part of your paper from the theoretical framework you choose support analysis of the research problem, or if appropriate, how the theoretical framework was found to be inadequate in explaining the phenomenon you were investigating. In that case, don't be afraid to propose your own theory based on your findings. Pwede naman yon. Now, so, what's a theory and what's a hypothesis? Later on, may somebody discussed about the hypothesis, no? So, the term theory and hypothesis are often used interchangeably in newspapers and popular magazines and in non-academic settings. No? However, the difference between theory and hypothesis in scholarly research is important, particularly when using an experimental design. A theory is a well-established principle that has been developed to explain some aspect of the natural world. Theories arises from repeated observation and testing and incorporate facts, laws, predictions, and tested assumptions that are widely accepted. So rational choice theory, mayroon tayong tinatawag na grounded theory, mayroon tayong tinatawag na critical race theory. Then, Then on the other hand, no, a specific or the hypothesis is specific. No? Testable predictions about what you expect to happen in your study. So let's say, for example, an experiment designed to look at the relationship between study habits and test anxiety might have a hypothesis that states, let's say, example, no, ang ating hypothesis nun, we predict that the students with better study habits will suffer less test in anxiety. Unless your study is exploratory in nature, your hypothesis should always explain what you expect to happen during the course of your research. So the key distinctions are, a theory predicts events in a broad general context. A hypothesis makes a specific prediction about a specified set of circumstances. Again, a theory has been extensively tested and is generally accepted among scholars. Hypothesis is a speculative guess that has yet to be tested. So, be prepared to challenge the validity of existing theory. Kasi yun ang ano natin kapag existing yung theory, no? So, minsan gagamitin na lang natin. So, theories are meant to be tested and their underlying assumption challenged. They are not rigid or intransigent, but are meant to set forth general principle for explaining phenomena, no, and or predicting outcomes. So given this testing theoretical assumption in an important way, that knowledge is any discipline develops and grows. So if you're asked to apply an existing theory to a research problem, the analysis may include the expectation by your professor that you should offer modification to the theory based on your research findings. Kailangan meron kayong meron kayong modification. Indication that theoretical assumption may need be modified can include, of course, your findings suggest that the theory does not explain or account for current conditions or circumstances. So, the study reveals that the theory or overly generalized behaviors or actions without taking into consideration specific factors like factors related to culture, nationality, history, gender, ethnicity, age, geographic location, legal norms or customs, regional social class and socio-economic status. So, yun yung mga consideration natin when it comes to theoretical framework. So now, maybe some of you, of course, are asking about the conceptual framework in research, no? So, the conceptual framework is written or visual representation of an expected relationship between variables, no? So, ito yung kadalasan ginagamitan natin ng IPO, no? Input, process, output, no? So, variables are simply the characteristic or properties that you want to study. So the conceptual framework is generally developed on a literature review of existing theories and theories about the topic. So if you want to know if students who study more hours get higher exam score, to investigate this question, you can use methods such as experiment or survey to test the relationship between the variables. No? So before you start collecting data, construct a conceptual framework to show exactly which variables you will measure and how you expect them to relate to each other. Because a conceptual framework can be designed in many different ways. So the form your take will depend on what kind of relationship you expect to find. No? I think we're somebody who assigned to discuss the independent variables. But if we want to test a cause and effect relationship, we need to identify at least two key variables. Again, the independent and dependent variable. So the expected cause and the expected effect. Diba? Pag doon sa binigay ko example kanina, syempre expected cause natin yung hours of study. Ang expected effect natin, yung effect score. Diba? Yung exam score niya. So in other words, exam score depends on hours of study. So our hypothesis is that the more hours a student studies, the better they will do on the exam. So the cause relationship often involve several independent variables that affects the dependent variable. So yun yung pag-develop natin ng ating conceptual framework, no? So we have also moderator versus mediator. We have control variables. We're in our, I think there's some presenters who will be able to discuss the dependent and independent variable. Ayoko naman kayo na anuhan pa ng maraming ano. So, in your conceptual framework, you shows that the reader have different elements from elements come together to facilitate research and a clear understanding of the results. So, a tool to help facilitate the understanding of the relationship among concept of variable in relation to the real world. So most commonly, sabi nga natin, ang conceptual framework, nag-illustrate siya what you expect to find through the research. It identifies the relevant variables, no, for your study and maps out how they might relate to each other. You should construct a conceptual framework before you begin collecting data. It is often represented in a visual format. Okay. So I think that's it for this topic.